What's the most insane coincidence you've experienced? Story 1. During my first semester of college, I moved out of state and was the first to move into the apartment. After orientation, I found my new roommate sitting on his bed. When I introduced myself, he asked where I was from. When I told him, he said, "I used to have a friend named Simon." I replied, "I used to have a friend named Will, who was my best friend in first and second grade until his family moved." Story 2. I was once mugged by 4 guys on one of the main shopping streets of Nairobi, Kenya. One of the guys had me in a chokehold, and just before I was about to pass out, they dropped me and ran. At the time, I didn't know why. 12 months later, while sitting on a bench on an island in Thailand, I met a British couple who did business in Kenya, and we started talking about how dangerous it was getting for foreigners. They described an incident from the year before of turning a corner and seeing a white guy being mugged, and a shopkeeper rescued him by hitting one of them over the head with a bat. They were in the same street on the same day at the exact same time I was there. It was me who they witnessed being mugged. What are the chances of randomly meeting up on a beach in Thailand a year later? Story 3. I live in Australia, and I have for almost my whole life, but I was born in Dubai. Every weekend in Dubai, my mom would take me to the Hilton Beach Club and sit me in front of the pastry chef to eat. We moved away from Dubai really early on, so I don't remember much. Fast forward to age 17, a new kid at school had just moved from a nearby town. We became friends and we both loved cricket, so we practiced a lot together. My dad and I were giving him a lift home after we were practicing, and my dad asked, "Where were you born?" And he says, "Dubai." The conversation continues, and I say I was born there too. Then he says, "My parents used to be the pastry chefs at the Hilton Beach Club," and this blew me away. Here we were, 16 years later, halfway across the world, and every weekend I sat in front of his parents and ate what they made for me. To this day, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I mean, what are the chances? Story 4. A few years ago, I got into a cab heading out for the evening in downtown Toronto. Shortly after being dropped off, I realized I left my phone in the cab. I tried calling it with no luck. I called the cab company, but because I had flagged the cab and paid cash, they had no real way of knowing which cab I was in. I figured the phone was as good as gone and went about my night. Many hours later, and having moved around the city quite a bit, I was ready to call it a night, so I flagged another cab. Sitting in the back seat, I started to think the driver looked familiar and realized I was in the same cab I took earlier. He hadn't found the phone, but I started looking anyways, and sure enough, there it was, jammed in the seat. Me and my flip phone were happily reunited, only for me to put it in a washing machine 2 days later. Story 5. In college, I went to a My Chemical Romance and Blink-182 concert with a couple of friends. We got a hotel near Jiffy Lube Live to have fun before the concert. I bought Wendy's on the way to the concert to eat in the parking lot beforehand, but I left it in the taxi. I was devastated. After the concert, we hailed a cab and got in. I felt a brown paper bag at my feet and looked down. The beautiful ginger on the bag was smiling up at my inebriated eyes as if to say, "I knew you'd come back." And yes, of course I ate it. Story 6. One Saturday night, I went out with friends and we decided to call our friend Al to see if he wanted to join us. This was in England long before mobile phones, so we had to use one of the iconic red phone booths. Someone was already using it, so we had to wait a few minutes. The guy left and we crammed into the booth. In those days, in order to make a call, you would first get a dial tone, then call the number. When the person answered, you would hear a bunch of beeps, at which point you would insert the coins. So I picked up the phone, but I heard no dial tone. I hung up the phone and tried again, but still no dial tone. It seemed to still be connected to the previous call. I said hello to see if anyone was still on the line. A person answered, saying, "Hello?" It was my friend Al. He had just picked up his phone to make a call, and somehow, miraculously, without even dialing his number, we were connected. We all went to the same place after and tried to figure out how the hell this happened, but it remains a mystery. If I did not have my friends with me at the time as witnesses, I would have believed it was my mind playing tricks on me. Story 7. In 2004, I was 18 and on a 3-week tour of Europe. I was at the Louvre and had just experienced that was the Mona Lisa exhibit. After looking at it for 2 minutes, I started to wander around aimlessly. As I was walking, an older couple asked if I knew how to get to the Mona Lisa exhibit. I told them yes, and because I'm horrible with directions, I'd be happy to walk them there myself. They were really nice and very appreciative that I was taking the time to help them. They asked me where I was from, the US and Nashville, but I mentioned my parents were immigrants from Italy. They told me they were from Portugal and on their anniversary. We talked a bit more, and I told them my name. They were really excited about it since I shared the same name as their grandchild. Anyways, we get to the exhibit, and I go to part ways and shake their hands, but I get pulled in for 2 massive hugs and a kiss on the cheek. They give me their address and say anytime I'm in Portugal to stop by, and I'll have a place to stay and eat. We take a group photo and leave. 7 years later, I'm in Munich for Oktoberfest. I'm standing outside my hotel, waiting for my friends, when an older couple asks if I know how to get to the fairgrounds. So since I'm headed there, I tell them they could just follow me and my friends. Again, we start talking about where we're all from. Now, I have a memory like an elephant, and once they mention they're from Portugal, I start to think maybe these are the same people. I ask them if they have grandkids, and they say they have 6. I ask if one of their names is History of Man. They look at each other, sort of surprised, and say yes. They ask how I knew that, and I tell them that I had met them 7 years prior in Paris at the Louvre. The old lady gets really happy and starts crying and starts to hug me. They say they remembered me now and asked why I never came to visit, that they had our picture in a frame on their wall and always wondered what happened to the nice American boy. We spent the next 3 hours catching up. Luckily, we got there early, so we were able to get an empty table, and they bought all the drinks the entire time. This time, they demanded I give them my email so we could keep in contact, and I even added their son on Facebook. 2 years later, I go and visit for the summer, and sure enough, there on the wall, amongst the rest of their family pictures, is 18-year-old me, standing between them. I'll tell you all something, I'm a bit of an introvert, and can be awkward when meeting new people, simply because I like to get a feel for who they are and where their boundaries are. But never in my life, other than with my own family, and maybe not even then, have I ever felt more at home and that I belonged than the 3 weeks I spent with them. We still talk weekly. It's like having a second family. Story 8. When I was 13, I was on a family holiday in Venice. We were on a gondola, Venetian punt boat, touring the waterways of the city. We got halfway down a long passageway, and another gondola passed us by, carrying a man and a woman and the punter. The man and my dad locked eyes, exclaimed each other's names, and had a quick handshake as our gondolas passed. Myself, brother, and mother sat quietly, pretty stunned, while the woman on the other boat exploded with, "What? Who's that? How do you know him?" We floated off in the other direction, comparatively swag and chill. Turns out it was a guy my dad went to university with and hadn't seen since. They haven't even contacted one another since. It's crazy they recognized one another, considering they were both in their late 40s now, passing fleetingly on 2 gondolas in Venice. Story 9. I tried to get into Six Flags with a tiny keychain Swiss Army knife. It literally had a dull 1-inch blade. They told me I could either throw it away, take it to my car a mile away, or rent a locker for like $10. So I decided to hide it in the planter. I looked down and saw a big piece of bark lying in the dirt, so I figured it would be a good hiding place. I picked it up and found another mini Swiss Army knife. I placed mine next to the first and went into the park. When I returned, the other knife was gone, and a smiley face was etched into the dirt in its place. Story 10. My family used to take little summer vacations. One summer, I was about 7 or 8, we stayed at a campground about 4 hours from home. There were a bunch of kids there, and one day, we all started playing tag. I was it, and was chasing another young boy, and when I tagged him, I pushed him too hard, and he fell and broke his arm. I remember the scene vividly. Fast forward to college. I became good friends with my neighbor in the dorm, and we ended up getting a place together our sophomore year. The following year, no longer living together, we went out for a few drinks, and the topic of broken bones came up. I've only broken one bone, and it was my arm when I was 7. Some kid at a campground pushed me over while playing tag. It was me. I still can't believe it. Story 11. One time, I parked, without even noticing, next to a car with the same license plate as me. I had a Massachusetts plate, and she had a New Hampshire plate, both with the same 5-digit number. The weirder thing was that both of us had kept the plate as a novelty plate because the state wasn't making 5-digit plate numbers anymore. But a family member wanted to keep it. In my case, my dad wanted to keep his dad's plate. Story 12. When I was in high school, I was aimlessly playing around in our library one day. Like any large public high school, our library had literally thousands of books quietly tucked away on shelves and rarely, if ever, touched. That day, I pulled a book at random from a shelf in the back and sat down to read it. After opening it, a slip of paper fell out, and I quickly recognized the dashed 10 digits written on it as a phone number. I hastily read the number, and it was my older sister's number, who had graduated from my high school years earlier. Someone had written her number and tucked it away into a random book in the back until I found it years later. Story 13. I once went camping with about 5 or so other friends. This was about 3 years ago now, in Pisgah National Forest in the mountains of North Carolina. There are some amazing waterfalls in this area, one called Rainbow Falls, which is about 125 feet from the river above to the ground below. If you keep hiking past Rainbow Falls, there is a much smaller waterfall in the river above called Turtleback Falls. It's basically a very slippery rock with water running over it, which ends with about a 4 to 5 foot drop. This is really cool because you can climb up it using a rope attached to a tree above, walk out to the middle of the rocks, and slide down. There's also another spot that's about 1/3 of the way up the side of Rainbow Falls, where you can climb up some branches, then basically rappel down a rock face, shimmy out on a ledge, and jump about 30 to 40 feet into the nice deep pool in the river at the bottom of the waterfall. It was when my friends and I had climbed out on the ledge and were about to jump when we noticed that there was another group of people hanging out in the river below us. They started cheering us on and encouraging us to jump, as it is slightly terrifying. Anyways, we ended up jumping, and once in the river below, we talked to some of the other group of people. They seemed pretty cool. Fast forward 1 year, and we had so much fun a year earlier that we decided to go back again. This time, we camped a little further down the river, and we decided to climb on some rocks downriver from the waterfall, about 300 or 400 yards from the waterfall. I was climbing on one rock and found something that looked like a strap of some kind. Assuming it was trash, I didn't touch it, but when I pointed it out to one of my friends, he noticed it was actually a GoPro camera in a waterproof case, so we decided to keep it. Fast forward a couple of days, my friend and I purchased a charger for that type of camera and decided to see what was on it. We started watching the video and saw some guys climbing up the place where we jumped off the side of the waterfall in front of the cameraman who was also climbing. The cameraman starts to get closer, and we saw something that made us instantly start to freak out. On the back left shoulder of the person in front of the cameraman was the exact tattoo that my friend has. When he gets even closer, we realize the person on the camera was my friend who I was currently sitting right beside. Later, the cameraman gets up to the ledge, and we see me and the rest of my friends from over a year ago. There are also some pictures and video of us jumping from the ledge. We watched the rest of the video in a stunned state, and the last 30 minutes or so of the footage is of the cameraman going up to the river above Rainbow Falls and sliding on Turtleback Falls, apparently losing his GoPro in the water after going over the falls. The camera sinks to the bottom, and you can even see fish swimming by and staring at the camera. Now think about where we found the camera, 400 to 500 yards downriver from the bottom of the large waterfall. So apparently, this camera made its way down the river over a 120-foot waterfall and got lodged in a rock 500 yards away. And my friends and I found it a year later with the footage of us from the previous year on it. It took us a little while to decide on this being the most reasonable explanation. Story 14. This coincidence is straight up sorcery. I was kayaking with my family along a river when I thought I would pull a fast one on my brother. So I yelled, "Hey, look, a bald eagle," to my brother, so I could do the whole "made you look" game. But to my surprise, he goes, "Cool." At this point, I think he is just messing with me, so I can't say the whole "made you look" thing. So I look up, and a bald eagle swoops down, catches a fish, and flies to the other side of the river. One of the most magical coincidences ever. Story 15. I'm an American who moved to Amsterdam some years ago, and in my first year there, on a random Saturday, I decided to head out for a drink. I sat down next to a cute German guy who was in town for the first time from 6 hours away, helping a friend move kind of thing. And it turns out he's doing a PhD in physics. I am doing mine in astronomy and have a physics background. So we spend maybe 10 minutes discussing our research topics when he mentions offhand how he used to study in New Zealand. I got a confused look and then got all excited. Johannes, Professor W's E&M class in Auckland, first half of 2007. Freaked him out until I explained. I was a semester abroad student in Auckland that year, and not only were we in the same class, we even did the same homework together and such. But we lost touch once I left the country, with no one having a clue what happened to the other, only to randomly run into each other 5 years later in a random bar in a random city on another continent. I don't know if I can ever top that one. It was pretty darn cool. Story 16. My aunt died young on October 3rd, 2007. On October 2nd, 2008, I was a senior in high school. I was in my art class one morning, sitting at a table of 4, when the teacher told me one person from each table to go grab a stack of newspapers for us to sculpt so that the tables don't all get messed up with clay. Another guy spreads out the newspapers, and then I begin to work. I notice that the paper at my seat is the obituary pages. I casually begin to read it and realize the paper is a year old, and the obituary listing, exactly under my right hand, was that of my aunt, who had died a full 365 days before. I'd like to think it was her way of saying hello and what's up to make sure I wasn't sculpting anything gross and inappropriate. Story 17. I've written about this before, but I still think it's insane, so here goes. When I was a little kid, my parents would take my sister and me to visit my great-grandmother in the nursing home. She was in her mid-90s, blind, and to young me, basically terrifying. I hated going to see her, to be honest. Every time we went, she would touch our faces, because blind, and talk to us a little. Meanwhile, her roommate somehow knew my name and would always try to grab me, even though my parents never said more to her than pleasantries. It always freaked me out. Fast forward to my mid-20s, my dad mentions, just casually as anything, that the roommate was his grandmother and my other great-grandmother. She didn't know my name. I am a junior and look like my dad, so she thought I was my father. She was senile after all. Apparently, there was a falling out when my dad was a kid, and he had no relationship with much of his extended family. She didn't recognize my dad because she'd never seen him as an adult. The messed up thing is they lived in a city nursing home, pretty big city too, and just by sheer coincidence, my parents' grandparents were roommates. Story 18. I met my now husband at work. Turns out, there are enough coincidences that my mom is seriously wondering whether we are distantly related. We were both born in the same hospital 2 weeks apart. We then both moved about 500 miles away and ended up in the same university together. We moved from there another 100 miles away and worked in the same company. We both have relatives in the same area in Dublin. We both have a relative who worked in the same hotel in Dublin at about the same time back in the 1930s. My mom and his grandmother have the exact same combination of unusual first and middle names. I have the same birthday as his mom. We don't live in Ireland. Story 19. A few years ago, when I had just become a bartender and was getting into the whole, "Oh my god, is it really that easy to get women's numbers?" phase, I ended up getting a girl's phone number one night and another girl's number the next night. So, I went right ahead and started texting both of them, blatantly using the same phrases and just changing out the names. However, come Monday morning, the bomb dropped. It turned out that not only did they go to the same university, but they were the same year level, same class, and were currently partners on some sort of assignment. They were not as amused as I was. This is how the conversation went. Me, text to both girls, "So, want to get some ice cream later?" Girl A, "I don't know. Why don't you ask Chloe?" Placeholder name, can't remember for the life of me. Girl B, "I don't know. Why don't you ask blah blah?" Creativity is not my strong suit. Me, still texting both, "Bring her along, we can make it a party." And then a couple of messages from both about how I'm disgusting, a loser, etc., etc. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward a couple of years later, I'm at some restaurant with some friends, and we bump into a mutual friend of ours, and he's with a couple of girls. We invite him to sit down with us, and we're all chatting away and happily making friends. I cozy up to one girl, and we start talking and flirting a bit. I tell her I'm a bartender, and she laughs and says, "I'll never date a bartender because of this one guy that," and she just stops and freezes and looks at me. Turns out it was girl A, and not enough time had passed to heal this particular wound. She got up and stormed off, never to be seen again. But wait, there's more. Fast forward about a year later, I went out clubbing, met a girl, and we hit it off. I wake up next morning, and lo and behold, it's girl A, and she was still not as amused as I was about the situation.